She escaped into the wilderness to meet her end. Shattered by sorrow, clutching nothing but echoes of her deceased spouse, she ventured into the infinite dunes, anticipating they would consume her entirely. Yet when she crumbled beneath the ruthless heat, a wanderer discovered her, a soul whose heart understood the burden of mourning. What began as salvation transformed into something beyond her imagination. Another opportunity for romance, an unfamiliar way of life, a total reinvention of her perceived identity. Yet certain changes demand payment. To discover how this remarkable real-life tale develops, hit that like button, subscribe for more incredible narratives, and share in the comments your viewing location. Let's explore this adventure together. The picture rested upside down on the bedside table, its edges worn smooth from endless handling. Emily Calloway's fingertips followed the wooden border through the shadows, learning its contours as she had each dawn for 3 months past. Thomas's missing presence weighed on her ribcage like wilderness sand, choking and infinite. Dawn light seeped through drapes she hadn't parted since the burial, throwing silhouettes that moved like ghosts across their once-shared room. Her wedding band felt strange now, a golden circle linking her to a spirit. She spun it mindlessly, the gesture polished smooth through countless repetitions, questioning when simple breathing had become such conscious labor. The locket pressed against her throat, its silver face capturing light fragments. Thomas had presented it during their final anniversary, while cancer had already started its silent conquest. Within, sandwiched between thin glass sheets, rested a desert lupine, violet and fragile, gathered during their Arizona honeymoon years. Earlier, he had chuckled at her desire to save it, calling her romantic. Now it seemed like fate. Emily lifted herself from bed with cautious motions of someone fearful of disturbing the atmosphere. Her image in the mirror shocked her, sunken features, gaze that had lost its spark. She resembled someone fading around the margins, growing transparent with mourning. The home murmured with vacancy. Thomas's mug remained in the basin, his spectacles folded beside an unfinished novel on the dining table. The artwork space he'd constructed in the converted garage sat deserted, paintings collecting dust like markers of her previous existence. She drifted through rooms like someone sleepwalking, collecting what seemed necessary. Fresh clothing, the buoy. Picture, the locket, the band she couldn't stand wearing yet couldn't abandon. The rucksack, his rucksack, still carrying hints of his fragrance, absorbed these pieces of their shared existence. Beyond, her sister Claire's texts gathered on her device like autumn leaves. "Please call back. I'm concerned. Work inquired about your absence. Emily, respond." But language had turned foreign, elusive, and undependable. What could she express? That reality had fractured the day Thomas departed, stranding her on existence's wrong side. That each morning she awoke amazed to find herself still alive when he wasn't. The car keys weighed heavy in her grasp. She lacked direction, only knowing that remaining meant yielding to what stayed behind. The wilderness beckoned, that enormous expanse where they'd found greatest joy, where lupines continued blooming each season regardless of human grief. Reversing from the drive, Emily glimpsed herself in the mirror once more. The person staring back was already transforming into someone different, existing between conclusion and commencement. The locket caught morning rays, its surface showing possibilities she couldn't yet envision. The highway extended ahead like an unfinished tale, pointing toward distant horizons promising only transformation. Main highways became smaller routes, which surrendered to dirt paths wandering into nothingness, like inquiries without solutions. Emily traveled until her fuel gauge demanded attention, pausing at stations feeling like frontier outposts. Each mile transported her further from the existence that no longer suited, deeper into terrain requiring only presence. The desert unfolded in amber and copper tones, marked by Joshua Tree's dark signatures. Here the heavens stretched wide enough to contain her entire sorrow without shattering. Distant peaks shimmered like illusions, proving even the most concrete things could seem insubstantial when viewed through grief's lens. She left the vehicle where pavement ended, abandoning it beside a weathered warning about floods and serpents. The pack settled familiarly across her shoulders as she walked deeper into silence only deserts possess. The sun rose overhead like an unblinking witness to her aimless pilgrimage. Each footfall crunched on sand and rock, matching her heartbeats. Rhythm. The locket swayed with her steps, catching light and reflecting small rebellions against her beige surroundings. Time stretched here, measured by light's changing quality rather than clocks, shadow patterns cast by barrel cacti and cholla. Emily wandered without destination, trusting her feet toward whatever awaited beyond the next rise, wash, or decision point. As afternoon shifted toward evening, thirst announced itself quietly. She'd brought water, insufficient for a journey whose length remained unknown. This realization arrived calmly, a simple observation, like noting stone's hardness or sky's blueness. The landscape transformed, becoming more rugged, more insistent in its splendor. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient guards, arms raised in eternal sky salutes. Palo Verde trees offered shade sketches, their green bark glowing against delicate leaf clusters. When she finally halted, her body had chosen for her. Emily settled, on a flat boulder retaining day's warmth, watching sunset begin its western mountain descent. The locket lay warm against her chest, its weight reminding her of love transcending physical presence. She considered Thomas, truly considered him, for the first time since fleeing home. Not the pale, weakened version from final weeks, but the man who'd laughed at her flower-preserving impulse, who'd built her studio by hand, who'd faced death with grace that both humbled and frightened her. "I'm lost without you," she whispered. To desert air. Wind caught her words, scattering them among thorns and stones where they settled like seeds, awaiting proper conditions to become something resembling hope. Stars emerged overhead, hesitant initially, then confident as darkness claimed the land. Emily reclined against her stone seat, watching the sky fill with lights that had traveled impossible distances to reach this moment, this place, this woman learning to exist between grief and grace. Dawn arrived like a physical assault. Emily, awakened, curled against rock, mouth coated with sand, empty water bottle beside her. The sun had climbed high enough to make standing feel like rebelling against air itself, which shimmered with heat waves turning distance into dreams. She attempted walking, but her legs had forgotten their function. Each step required negotiating. Between determination and flesh, a conversation her body was clearly losing. The locket burned where sun had heated it, yet she couldn't remove this final love connection. The landscape blurred at edges, becoming impressionistic. Cactus blooms blazed like miniature suns, their intensity seeming to pulse with independent heartbeats. The desert was revealing its hidden truth. Beauty and cruelty weren't opposites but partners in an ancient dance. When she collapsed, it was with complete surrender's grace. Sand was surprisingly welcoming, embracing her with Earth's indifference that had received countless others seeking its acceptance. Emily pressed her cheek to ground, feeling something vast and patient pulsing beneath. She was fading when sound reached her, not footsteps but something more purposeful, rhythmic, movement patterns suggesting intention rather than wandering. Through half-closed eyes she saw a figure approaching, dark against bright sky. Hands touched her shoulders with practiced gentleness, carefully rolling her to assess damage. A face appeared in her vision, brown skin weathered by sun and wind, eyes holding unmeasurable depth. Water touched her lips, warm and tasting of leather and careful conservation. Words came in a language older than English, sounds seeming to rise from desert itself, then accented English. "Can you hear me?" Emily attempted responding, but managed only a slight nod. The man, she could see now he was male, perhaps 40, with long black hair secured by leather, continued offering water in small portions, his movements economical and certain. "I'm taking you to safety," he said. Though simple, his words carried absolute certainty's weight. She felt herself lifted, cradled against a chest smelling of sage, wood, and something indefinably wild. The motion should have jarred, but instead felt like floating, as if she'd become weightless, approaching death. Through heat exhaustion and dehydration's haze, Emily sensed movement across terrain impossible for her to navigate alone. The man carried her with sure-footedness of someone knowing this land like his own breathing rhythm. Time compressed and expanded like breathing. Then came voices, female voices speaking that same ancient-sounding language. Cool shadows fell across her, face bringing sense of earth, herbs, and possibly hope. Different hands began tending her. Gentle, knowledgeable hands speaking of generational healing practice. Water flowed more freely now, and her cracked lips received something tasting of mint and unidentifiable herbs. As awareness returned in waves, Emily realized, she lay on something soft. Not a conventional bed, but carefully arranged cloth layers. Nearby voices murmured consultation and concern in tones needing no translation. The locket still rested against her chest, its weight reassuring that some things survived even complete undoing. She closed her eyes, drifting on these new voices' current, these unexpected hands that had pulled her from disappearing entirely. Upon waking again, she found an elderly woman sitting nearby, brown hands busy with weaving. The woman looked up as Emily stirred, her face transforming with a smile holding all of stone and sky's patience. "Better," the woman said in careful English. "Water, rest, better." Emily tried sitting up, but the woman's hand pressed firmly against her shoulder, gentle but absolute, grandmother's authority wrapped in kindness. "My name is Nasha," the woman said. "You are safe now." 3 days passed in floating space between sleep and waking. Emily existed in fragments, herbal teas coaxing her throat back to life, voices rising and falling like music in unknown languages, hands knowing exactly how much water her body could handle at each recovery stage. When she finally sat up unassisted, the world revealed itself in breath-catching ways. She was inside a structure harmonizing with rather than opposing the desert. Low ceiling, breathing walls, openings positioned to catch morning sun while deflecting afternoon's killing heat. Nasha sat nearby, fingers working plant fibers that seemed transforming into baskets through some alchemy Emily couldn't follow. The woman's movements were visible meditation, each gesture deliberate and connected in an unbroken purpose chain. "You are with the Diné," Nasha said, using a word Emily would learn meant the people in their language. "My grandson found you in the desert, 3 days' walk from here near where antelope drink." Memory returned in pieces, endless walking, surrendering to sand and sun, hands lifting her when her body finally acknowledged its limits. "I should thank him." Nasha's smile carried depths Emily recognized as characteristic of this place, these people. "Tariel will return at sunset. He is—" She paused, searching for words. "He hunts, but not with guns. He learns animal ways where they go, what they need, the old ways." As if summoned, footsteps approached from outside. The man ducking through the doorway was the face from her fevered memories, but seen now in full awareness. He carried presence, speaking of someone completely at home in landscapes that would swallow most people without trace. He moved with fluid economy of someone understanding that every gesture had consequence where resources were precious and excessive. Movement could mean the difference between success and failure. When he looked at Emily, his eyes held still water's quality, reflective, deep, impossible to read from surface. "You are better," he said. "Not a question. Because of you. Thank you for—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing rescue, life, the inexplicable fact of sitting upright instead of bleaching into sand somewhere under desert sun. Tariel exchanged words with Nasha in their language. The conversation was brief, but Emily caught undercurrents making the older woman's expression sharpen with possible concern. "There is something we must discuss," Tariel said finally. "When I brought you here, I followed old obligations. When a man saves a woman's life and brings her to his home for healing, she becomes his responsibility. According to our ways," he paused, studying her face, "she becomes his wife." The words hung in air like heat shimmer, distorting everything around them. Emily felt the locket's weight against her chest, Thomas's ring in her pocket, where she'd moved it when her fingers swelled too much to wear it. "I don't understand." "It is traditional way," Nasha said gently. "When life is saved, obligation is created. Balance must be maintained." Emily's mind reeled. "But I didn't know, I didn't agree to anything." "Which is why," Tariel said, "the ceremony has not been performed. You are free to leave when completely healed. But while you remain here, you are under protection that comes with this arrangement." Unintended consequences' weight settled over Emily like dust. She had fled to the desert seeking only escape, and found herself entangled in customs she didn't understand, obligations she hadn't chosen. "How long before I can travel?" Tariel and Nasha exchanged another look. "Perhaps a week," Nasha said. "Your body needs time to remember itself." "A week?" 7 days in this place existing outside the world she knew, among people whose kindness came wrapped in traditions, feeling as foreign as their language. Emily touched the locket through her shirt, trying to imagine Thomas's reaction to this impossible situation. But for the first time since his death, thinking of him didn't bring crushing loss. Instead, she could almost hear his voice tinged with amusement he'd always found in life's unexpected turns. "Well, love, this is one I didn't see coming." "1 week," she said, and Nasha nodded, as if Emily had agreed to something much larger than simple time measurement. The days developed their own rhythm, as predictable and comforting as sunrise and sunset cycles, marking time in this place outside time. Emily woke to Nasha's quiet movements, morning routine so practiced it seemed choreographed. Water heated over fire, never allowed to die completely. Tea steeped from unidentifiable plants, whose bittersweet taste was becoming familiar. Her body remembered strength gradually, like a song recalled one note at a time. Each morning brought slightly straighter sitting, longer wakefulness, more steps outside the hogan before needing rest. The desert that had nearly claimed her revealed itself slowly as a place of intricate beauty. Not the empty wasteland she'd walked into, but an ecosystem of subtle relationships and careful balance. Tariel appeared and disappeared with weather's regularity. Sometimes she'd wake to find fresh water in bedside containers. Sometimes small items appeared, speaking of his attention to her recovery. Smooth stones, perfect for warming by fire and placing against sore muscles, or dried meat strips, tasting of smoke and patience. They communicated through language existing mostly in spaces between words. When she struggled to stand, his hand would appear at her elbow, not grasping or demanding, but simply present, ready to offer support if she chose to accept it. When afternoon heat became overwhelming, He would adjust doorway covering to create cross breezes moving air without creating drafts. Emily found herself studying his movements, the way she'd once studied light playing on water, trying to understand principles governing his world interactions. Everything he did seemed arising from deep listening, to wind, to distant animal sounds, to subtle temperature changes preceding weather shifts she couldn't feel. He was married before, Nasha told her one afternoon as they sat together, Emily attempting to mimic the older woman's basket-weaving technique. A good woman, strong. She and their son died in the sickness that came 5 winters ago. Emily's fingers stilled on plant fibers she was learning to work. "I'm sorry." He grieved. Properly, long time, too long, some say. Nasha's hands never paused in their weaving, creating patterns seeming to emerge organically from materials themselves. But grief has its own seasons, cannot be hurried, like seeds in winter ground. The words settled into Emily's understanding, like water into sand. She thought of Thomas, of the weight she carried, of how grief had become the only thing feeling real about her existence. How do you know when... She struggled with the question. How do you know when it's time to stop? Grieving. Nasha looked up from her work, dark eyes holding depths Emily was still learning to read. Grief never stops, but it changes. Like river that cuts new channels when old ones fill with stones. Water still flows, but finds new ways. That evening, Tariel returned carrying something wrapped in soft leather. He approached Emily where she sat outside the hogan, watching first stars appear in deepening sky. "For you," he said simply, offering the bundle. Inside the leather wrapping lay a bracelet of turquoise and silver, stones the color of summer sky after rain. The metalwork was delicate but strong, each element connected to the next in patterns, speaking of meaning Emily couldn't decode but somehow felt in her bones. "It was my mother's," Tariel said. "She would want it to help someone heal." Emily stared at the bracelet, understanding the weight of what was being offered. Not just jewelry, but inheritance, history, trust given form in silver and stone. "I can't accept this. It's too much, too important." "Things are only important when they serve their purpose," Tariel said. "This has been waiting for someone who needed its medicine." When Emily looked up to meet his eyes, she found something there that made her breath catch. Not possession or expectation, but recognition, as if he saw something in her that she had forgotten existed. She slipped the bracelet over her wrist, and the turquoise caught day's last light, holding it like promises she wasn't ready to make, but couldn't quite bring herself to refuse. Emily woke to engines' sound, mechanical growling that seemed obscene against the desert's morning silence. Through the hogan's doorway, she could see dust clouds approaching from the east, vehicles moving with official business's purposeful speed. Nasha appeared beside her, the older woman's face calm but alert. "Government men," she said. "They come, sometimes looking for things, asking questions." The vehicles, 2 white SUVs with government plates, stopped at what Emily was beginning to understand was the small community's ceremonial center. Uniformed men emerged, consulting papers and scanning surroundings with systematic attention, of people whose job was cataloging and controlling. Tariel materialized from whatever work had occupied his morning, his movements deliberate as he walked toward the vehicles. Emily watched. Through the doorway as conversations began, English mixed with Dine's musical cadences, gestures speaking of negotiation rather than confrontation. "They are looking for you," Nasha said quietly. The word struck Emily like physical blows. Of course, her sister would have filed missing person reports. Her car, abandoned beside that dusty road, would have been found. Concern's careful bureaucracy would have triggered searches, investigations. The entire machinery of a world that couldn't simply let people disappear into silence. One uniformed man was walking toward the hogan now, flanked by Tariel, whose expression had settled into something unreadable. Emily felt the bracelet on her wrist like a weight, the turquoise stones cool against her skin. Emily Calloway. The official was young, his face kind but serious. "I'm Agent Morrison with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Your sister filed a missing person report. We've been searching for you for over a week." Emily emerged from the hogan, aware of how she must look, hair bleached by sun and wind, skin tanned to copper, wearing borrowed clothes that smelled of sage smoke and desert air. The woman these men had come looking for felt like someone from another life entirely. "I'm fine," she said. "I wasn't missing, I was just traveling." Agent Morrison consulted his papers. "Your vehicle was found abandoned. No indication of where you had gone. Your sister indicated you might not have been thinking clearly due to a recent bereavement." The harsh words cut deep, carrying an uncomfortable truth within them. Her mind hadn't been functioning clearly during that fateful desert drive. Grief had taken control of her thoughts, operating by its own twisted reasoning rather than common sense. "I'm choosing to remain here," Emily declared, surprised by the steady conviction in her tone. "Mom, I have to understand what's happening. How did you end up in this place? Is someone forcing you to stay?" Tariel broke his silence since arriving at the scene. "She was perishing in the wasteland. I rescued her and brought her here for healing. She's completely free to depart whenever she wishes." Agent Morrison's gaze shifted back and forth between Emily and Tariel, obviously struggling to categorize a scenario that fell outside his standard training protocols. "Mrs. Calloway, I must ask you directly. Do you wish to come with us right now? We can have you back at your residence before nightfall." Home? The concept felt alien, like trying to recall a forgotten language. She pictured the house where Thomas's void dominated every corner, her art workspace collecting dust, the carefully assembled existence that had revolved around someone who no longer existed. "No," she replied firmly. "I'm not prepared to leave just yet." The agent's brow furrowed. "How much longer do you plan to remain?" Emily glanced at Tariel, then at Nasher standing in the hogan's entrance, and finally at the endless desert expanse. The metal pendant rested warmly against her chest, Thomas's ring concealed in her pocket, while the turquoise bracelet circled her wrist like an unanswered question. "I'm uncertain," she admitted, recognizing it as her first truly honest statement in months. Agent Morrison observed her carefully before scribbling notes on his documents. "I must file a report confirming your location and well-being. Should you reconsider, contact us right away." He extended a card bearing official contact information and government seals, then hesitated. "Mrs. Calloway, are you certain you're making this choice with sound judgment?" Emily pressed her hand against the metal pendant beneath her shirt, feeling the preserved lupine that had somehow endured love, loss, and the brutal desert climate. "Sound enough," she answered. Once the federal officials departed, leaving behind trails of dust and bureaucratic worry, the community resumed its natural patterns with the grace of water seeking its proper level. Emily noticed her presence had evolved from curiosity into accepted reality. She received acknowledging nods and became part of the silent communications flowing between the women during their daily tasks. Nasha began instructing her with the patience of someone who recognized that genuine learning occurred in stages, each ability building upon previous foundations. First came plant knowledge, which species stored water in their root systems, which leaves could be steeped for various remedies, which blossoms opened at specific times, and what their blooming revealed about weather patterns, seasons, and the subtle shifts marking time's passage in this environment. Emily's hands, softened by years of teaching art to suburban students, gradually recalled more ancient purposes. She learned to recognize plants through touch alongside sight, distinguishing between stems that maintained strength when dried versus those that would crumble. Her fingertips developed protective calluses from handling tough plant fibers, and she felt an unexpected pride in these small evidence of adaptation. The basket taking shape under her guidance progressed slowly, each added ring becoming a meditation on perseverance. Nasha demonstrated proper tension maintenance and how to interpret materials for their flexibility versus their requirement to preserve structural integrity. Similar to humans, Nasha commented one afternoon as Emily wrestled with a particularly stubborn section. Must understand when to yield, when to stand firm. Tariel materialized each evening like a force of nature, his arrival so integrated into the daily rhythm that Emily found herself anticipating the sounds announcing his return, his distinctive footfall patterns on various surfaces, the gentle whistle signaling the community of his approach. He provided offerings that weren't exactly gifts, practical items that mysteriously appeared where Emily would discover them. A piece of polished wood ideal for the specific basket weaving method she was mastering, stones that nestled perfectly in her palm, making them perfect for grinding the pigments Nasha taught her to extract from desert vegetation. He is pursuing you, Nasha mentioned casually one day, dropping the observation into conversation as naturally as weather commentary. Emily's weaving hands froze. I assumed it was due to obligation, the traditional customs that brought me here. But duty doesn't generate emotion. He chooses courtship because his heart has chosen. You accept his offerings because your heart is beginning to choose as well. The insight settled in Emily's chest like a warm stone, substantial and weighty. She touched the turquoise bracelet, noting its familiar presence on her wrist. When had it transformed from foreign object to natural extension of her skin? That evening, Tariel approached where she sat outside the hogan, observing sunset's amber and rose hues painting the western horizon. "Would you accompany me on a walk?" he requested. They departed the community in comfortable silence, following a trail winding between towering saguaros and scattered boulder formations. The desert was undergoing its transformation from diurnal to nocturnal creature, the subtle transition of sounds and fragrances marking the changing of shifts between day and night dwellers. Their destination was a red rock formation carved by wind and water into nearly architectural shapes, columns and archways framing the darkening sky like portals into eternity. "I visit this place when contemplation is needed," Tariel explained, "when important choices must be made." Emily understood she was receiving something precious, not merely access to this location, but invitation into the parts of himself requiring solitude to fully exist. "It's magnificent," she said, immediately recognizing the word's insufficiency. "My wife cherished this spot," Tariel shared quietly. She believed it was where earth and sky remembered their shared narrative. Emily felt the significance of being entrusted with this memory, this sharing of the woman who had previously occupied his heart's center. "Do you believe she would object to your bringing me here?" Tariel remained silent so long that Emily wondered if she had crossed some invisible boundary. When he finally responded, his voice carried the texture of careful thought. "She would want assurance that you comprehend what it means to lose someone whose absence alters the world's very structure." Emily touched the metal pendant, feeling the pressed lupine within its silver housing. "Yes, I understand that completely, and she would want confirmation that you're not attempting to substitute what was lost, but are prepared to construct something new from what endures." The words suspended themselves in the desert air, like stars emerging in the deepening sky. Emily sensed something shifting within her chest, some careful architecture of grief and self-protection, beginning to reveal spaces where alternative possibilities might flourish. "I'm frightened," she confessed. "Fear represents wisdom's method of preparing us for transformation," Tariel replied. "Only those with nothing valuable to protect remain unafraid." They stood together in the gathering darkness, two individuals who had discovered that love could conclude, and that conclusion didn't invalidate the love that had preceded it. Around them, the desert settled into its nighttime identity, filled with subtle sounds and concealed movements, life maintaining its ancient persistence despite every form of ending. The correspondence arrived with the following week's supply, delivery, carried by the weathered individual who transported mail and provisions to the community bi-monthly. Emily immediately recognized Claire's handwriting, precise, urgent script that seemed to vibrate with barely restrained anxiety. "Emily, I cannot comprehend your actions, but I'm coming to witness this personally." The agent provided directions. "I'll arrive next Saturday. We must discuss this. Love, Claire." Emily stared at the paper until the words became unclear, sensing the delicate piece she had begun constructing trembling at its foundation. Claire represented the world that measured existence in academic terms and lesson plans, that viewed grief as something to be processed efficiently, then archived away. How could she explain that healing sometimes demanded becoming entirely new, not merely repairing what was damaged? "Your sister?" Nasha inquired, interpreting Emily's expression more than the letter's contents. "She's arriving here next Saturday." Nasha nodded as though she had anticipated this development. Family creates its own responsibilities. Cannot be dismissed even when we prefer otherwise. The following week felt like preparing for a collision between two distinct ways of being. Emily found herself viewing the community through Claire's perspective. The simplicity that might appear as poverty, the traditions that could seem primitive, the desert that would look barren to someone who hadn't learned to decipher its complexities. Tariel sensed her unease without requiring explanation. He appeared one morning carrying unfamiliar materials, clay that felt different from local earth, tools designed for purposes she couldn't immediately identify. "Pottery," he said, responding to her questioning expression. "Nasha mentioned you. Teach art. Perhaps you'd enjoy experiencing our method of creating beautiful objects." The clay proved revelatory under her touch, unlike any she had previously worked with. It maintained its form with stubborn dignity while remaining responsive to pressure, to the delicate negotiations between intention and material possibility. Working with it required conversation rather than domination, each piece emerging from collaborative dialogue between creator and medium. As her hands rediscovered the joy of creation, Emily felt something loosening within her chest. Her first bowl emerged lopsided and imperfect, yet it held water without leaking. The second achieved better balance, its rim even, its curve pleasing to both eye and palm. By week's end, she was producing vessels bearing unmistakable traces of her aesthetic sensibility, while honoring the traditions Tariel and Nasha had shared with her. "You possess skilled hands for this work," Teal observed, watching her craft what might have been her 10th water jug attempt. "Patient hands." Emily examined her fingers, noting the clay-stained calluses and new strength in muscles unused since graduate school. These hands had held Thomas during his final days, packed a lifetime into a single backpack, learned basket weaving, and now shaped earth into objects both beautiful and functional. "I believe they're finally remembering their true purpose," she said. Saturday arrived with the relentless punctuality of all dreaded appointments. Emily woke before dawn, unable to sleep through the anxiety that had settled in her stomach like stones. She dressed carefully, jeans and a simple shirt, the turquoise bracelet visible on her wrist, the metal pendant concealed beneath her collar. Claire's rental car approach was unmistakable. Engine strain from someone unaccustomed to dirt roads. The particular rhythm of uncertainty made automotive. Emily stood before the Hogan and watched dust clouds announce her sister's arrival, like smoke signals, telegraphing the return of a world she had abandoned. Claire emerged from the vehicle looking exactly like herself. Pressed khakis, practical shoes, hair styled with products that would wilt in the desert heat within hours. She paused momentarily, surveying the settlement with eyes that catalogued and measured, attempting to fit what she observed into familiar frameworks. When her gaze located Emily, her expression cycled through surprise, concern, and something resembling relief. "Jesus, Em, I've been terrified." Claire's voice carried the particular strain of someone who had spent weeks imagining catastrophic scenarios. Emily approached, noting how strange it felt to embrace someone who carried familiar perfume and urban air conditioning scents. Claire felt smaller than remembered, more fragile, as if the desert's immensity had already begun placing her in perspective. "I'm fine," Emily said. "Better than fine." Claire stepped back to study her sister's face, and Emily saw herself reflected. In her sister's eyes, skin bronzed by sun, hair bleached to shades Claire had never witnessed, something in her expression that hadn't existed before. "You appear—" Claire paused, searching for words. "Changed. I am changed." The simple declaration hung between them like a bridge neither was certain they wanted to cross. Claire's initial day in the community became a study in visible cultural collision. She navigated the spaces like someone attempting to use maps drawn for different terrain. Her gestures too expansive, her voice too sharp for the desert's acoustic requirements. Emily observed her sister trying to comprehend daily routines operating by logic Claire couldn't access. Water usage calculated to precise ounces, meals appearing, through collective effort rather than individual planning, conversations flowing between languages as easily as streams finding their course around obstacles. "Where exactly do you sleep?" Claire asked, peering into the Hogan with barely concealed horror. "Here it's comfortable once you adapt to it." "Emily, this is—" Claire gestured helplessly. "This isn't sustainable. You cannot simply abandon your entire existence because you're grieving." The words struck like physical blows, partially because they contained fragments of truth Emily hadn't been prepared to examine. She was grieving. She had abandoned her previous existence. But Claire's assessment missed the crucial element, that abandonment sometimes created space for unexpected forms of development. "I'm not abandoning anything," Emily said carefully. "I'm selecting something different." "Different?" "Em, you're living in what essentially amounts to a tent in the middle of nowhere, with people you barely know because some cultural obligation says you must marry a man you met 3 weeks ago." Nasha appeared at Emily's shoulder with the timing of someone who had developed radar for family crisis. She studied Claire with the same attention she might give weather patterns, reading signs and pressures invisible to untrained eyes. "Your sister is frightened," Nasha said to Emily as if Claire weren't present. "Fear makes people see only what might be lost, not what might be discovered." Claire's expression shifted, caught between indignation at being discussed as if absent, and surprise at being so accurately diagnosed by a stranger. "I'm not frightened," Claire protested. "I'm concerned. There's a distinction." "Yes," Nasha agreed mildly. "Fear is honest. Concern is fear wearing prettier clothing." Emily found herself torn between the impulse to defend Claire and recognition that Nasha's observation held uncomfortable accuracy. Her sister was frightened, afraid of losing the Emily she had always known, afraid of changes she couldn't control or comprehend. "Perhaps we should walk," Emily suggested. "Let me show you some of the area." They moved away from the community, following paths that had become familiar to Emily's feet. Claire struggled with the uneven terrain, her city shoes inadequate for ground demanding attention to every step. "Tell me about him," Claire said finally. "This Tariel." Emily considered how to translate someone like Tariel into terms Claire could understand. How do you explain the way he moved through landscape as if he were part of its ecosystem? The gifts that appeared without ceremony or expectation, the patience that felt deeper than mere politeness. "He's kind," she said finally, "and quiet. He understands things without needing them explained. That's hardly a comprehensive character reference, Em. He saved my life. When I was ready to die in the desert, he carried me to safety and asked for nothing in return." Claire stopped walking. "Ready to die? Emily, did you go out there planning to hurt yourself?" The question hung in the desert air like heat shimmer, distorting everything around it. Emily realized that in all her careful avoidance of her sister's calls, all her fleeing from the world that knew her as Thomas's widow, she had never considered how her disappearance might be interpreted by people who loved her. "I wasn't planning anything," she said slowly. "I was just walking away from a life that no longer fit. I didn't care what happened next." "Jesus, Em," Claire's voice cracked on the words. "I should have done something. Should have made you talk. To someone, get help. What could you have done? Therapy, medication, time?" Emily felt something hot rising in her chest. "There is no fixing the fact that the person you built your life around is gone. There's only learning to be someone who can exist without them." They had reached the red rock formation where Tariel had brought her that first evening. Emily settled on one of the natural stone seats, and after a moment Claire joined her. Her breathing labored from the walk and the altitude and the weight of conversations she hadn't been prepared to have. "I miss him too," Claire said quietly. "Thomas, he was like the brother I never had." Emily felt tears she hadn't allowed herself for weeks beginning to gather behind her eyes. In all her careful construction of new possibilities, she had forgotten that Thomas's death had created ripples of loss extending far beyond her own grief. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry I just disappeared. I didn't know how to. I couldn't bear being the Emily who used to be married to Thomas. I needed to discover who I could be instead." Claire reached for Emily's hand, her fingers automatically, finding the turquoise bracelet. "And have you discovered who that is?" Emily looked out over the desert that had nearly claimed her life, and then taught her how to live differently. The question felt larger than any answer she was ready to give. "I'm beginning to," she said. Claire spent 3 days in the community, and Emily watched her sister's resistance gradually transform into something more complex. Not acceptance exactly, but recognition that the life Emily was building contained elements Claire's own world lacked. On the second day, Nasha invited Claire to help with food preparation, and Emily saw her sister's surprise when the older woman's hands proved as skilled with a laptop computer as they were with traditional tools. The community, Emily realized, existed in multiple centuries simultaneously, choosing which technologies served their purposes while maintaining connections to older ways of knowing. "They have satellite internet," Claire said that evening, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone whose assumptions had been gently dismantled, "and solar panels and a community health worker who monitors everyone's medical needs through some kind of telemedicine program." Emily nodded, understanding that her sister was beginning to see past the surface simplicity to the sophisticated adaptation that characterized life here. "It's not about rejecting the modern world," Emily said. "It's about choosing which parts of it actually improve life and which parts just create noise." On the third day, Tariel offered to take Claire on what he called a plant walk, a tour of the desert's medicinal and edible resources. Emily watched them disappear into the landscape together, Claire's initial stiffness gradually relaxing as Tariel's quiet competence made itself evident. They returned hours later, Claire carrying a small collection of seeds and dried leaves, her face flushed with sun and something that looked like wonder. "Did you know," she said to Emily, "that there are at least 30 different plants within walking distance that can treat various ailments, and he can identify them by smell as much as sight, and that the traditional knowledge about their uses has been tested by modern research and found to be scientifically accurate?" Emily smiled, recognizing the tone of someone whose worldview had just expanded in unexpected directions. That evening, as Claire packed for her departure, she sat beside Emily outside the Hogan and spoke the words Emily had been dreading. "I still think you should come home with me." Emily felt her chest tighten. "Claire, not forever, just for a visit, to handle Thomas's affairs properly, to close out the school year, to give yourself time to think about this without the pressure of immediate decisions." The practical considerations Claire outlined were real: legal documents requiring signatures, financial matters needing attention, a life that couldn't simply be left in suspension indefinitely. But the thought of returning to those empty rooms, to the weight of Thomas's absence, made visible in every object that remained behind, felt like volunteering to drown. "I can't," Emily said. "Not yet." "Then when?" Emily touched the metal pendant through her shirt, felt the turquoise bracelet cool against her wrist. Around them the desert was settling into its evening rhythms, the community preparing for another night of rest that felt earned rather than simply scheduled. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe never." Claire was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice carried a sadness Emily hadn't heard since the day of Thomas's funeral. "I'm scared I'm losing you too." The words broke something open in Emily's chest. She turned to face her sister fully, seeing for the first time the weight Claire had been carrying. Not just worry about Emily's choices, but fear that Emily's transformation would take her beyond the reach of their shared history. "You're not losing me," Emily said. "I'm just becoming someone new, someone who can survive what happened, someone who might even be able to find happiness again." "With him? With Tariel?" Emily looked toward where she could see Tariel working near the community fire, his movements economical and sure. Her sister posed the identical question that had haunted Emily during those restless hours between sleep and consciousness. "I'm not certain yet," she replied with complete honesty, "but I need the opportunity to discover the answer." Claire gave a slow nod, like someone accepting conditions she couldn't fully grasp, but lacked the strength to oppose. "Promise you'll maintain contact. Real communication, not vanishing for months at a time." "I give you my word." "And promise you'll consider returning home someday, not permanently, but to sort out the practicalities, to have proper closure." Emily sensed the burden of responsibilities tugging at her with the force of gravity. She would eventually need to go back and settle matters with her old existence, but not now. Not before she understood who she'd become upon her return. "I'll consider it," she promised. Claire's departure the following morning felt like witnessing a piece of her soul drive into the distance amid swirling dust and incomplete conversations. Emily remained waving until the vehicle vanished beyond the road's curve, then discovered Tariel standing close by. "Hard?" he inquired. "Essential," Emily responded, recognizing the truth in her words. Later that day, Agent Morrison came back bearing documents for Emily's signature, official papers confirming her willing residence on the reservation, paperwork that would permit her legal stay while she determined her next steps. Signing each document, Emily experienced the significance of actively choosing to remain versus simply not departing. The difference seemed massive, the gap between floating aimlessly and making deliberate choices. After the agent left, Nasha materialized beside her with impeccable timing. "Now," the elder woman declared, We can start the genuine instruction. What Nasha termed genuine instruction started with forgetting previous knowledge. Emily realized that much of her assumed understanding about art, about the bond between artist and artwork, needed complete restructuring in this environment, where beauty always served function, where visual appeal and practicality weren't enemies, but allies in survival's timeless rhythm. In your society, Nasha explained while they crafted increasingly sophisticated pottery, you create lovely objects for wall display, meant for viewing, not handling. In this place, beauty must justify itself by supporting existence. Emily mastered, shaping clay that could contain water without cracking, weaving baskets capable of bearing weight without breaking, fashioning items that pleased both sight and touch. Her hands gained fresh types of wisdom, detecting clay's moisture levels, sensing fiber tension, treating materials as living collaborators rather than inactive elements for manipulation. The activity transformed into contemplation, each creation becoming a dialogue between purpose and potential. Emily discovered the metal locket no longer pressed against her chest like a burden, but rested there like a charm linking yesterday and today, enabling her to carry Thomas's affection forward, without remaining trapped by his loss. Tariel emerged during these educational moments, providing help that never seemed invasive. He delivered various clays for Emily's experiments, each possessing unique characteristics, some firing to rich crimson, others staying light amber. Additional types accepted glazes in ways that produced results Emily had never accomplished in her suburban workshop. "What's the source of these?" she wondered aloud one day, fingers moving through clay so refined it resembled silk. "Various locations," Tariel explained, each containing its own healing properties, its own function. Some originate from mountain areas where lightning has struck the earth. Others come from regions where particular vegetation grows. Still others from holy places where we must seek permission before harvesting. Emily started comprehending that everything in this place existed within networks of connection and duty. She was barely beginning to grasp. The clay held narratives of its origins, responsibilities regarding proper usage, links to the terrain that had formed it through centuries of climate and time. As her abilities progressed, Emily created works completely unlike anything from her past. Vessels whose contours mirrored distant mountain ridges, water containers adorned with designs that appeared to spring from the clay naturally rather than being forced from external sources. Items that seemed like interpretations between her creative perspective and this location's artistic values. "These show quality," Nasha observed one afternoon, examining bowls Emily had recently completed. "They contain your essence, yet they comprehend their place." The praise felt tremendous, confirmation of something Emily hadn't realized she sought, the chance that change didn't demand discarding her entire past, but discovering methods for former and current identities to exist together. That evening, Tariel approached wearing an expression she'd learned indicated importance. "Something exists that I wish to reveal to you," he said. "However, it demands a trek, 2 days of walking, carrying all necessities." Emily's heartbeat accelerated. Since arriving months ago, her wanderings had been restricted to single-day journeys, always returning to the community by nightfall. The concept of venturing deeper into the wilderness, spending nights beneath open skies with only Tariel as company, seemed simultaneously exciting and frightening. "What lies out there?" "Clay," Tariel answered. "The type reserved for ritual objects, the kind requiring respectful and prepared approach." Emily grasped that she was being granted access to something holy, inclusion in ceremonies visitors typically weren't allowed to observe. The trust implied in this invitation felt more significant than the turquoise bracelet encircling her wrist. "When would we depart?" When you feel prepared, when the moment seems appropriate to both of us. That night, Emily remained awake, listening to the desert's nocturnal orchestra. Coyote voices intertwining with insect rhythms, wind whistling through ocotillo spines, subtle sounds of landscape shifting from day to night awareness. She contemplated readiness, the distinction between being truly ready and having sufficient courage to try regardless. 6 months earlier, she had been a suburban widow escaping from an existence that no longer held meaning. Now she was someone capable of molding clay into containers, serving purposes beyond ornamentation, who could interpret weather through plant responses, who wore turquoise like a vow she was still learning to fulfill. The metal locket rested warmly against her chest, yet for the first time since Thomas's passing, it felt less like an anchor and more like a benediction. His love had transformed into permission to love once more, differently but equally deeply. When dawn arrived, Emily discovered Tariel seated outside the hogan, already prepared for travel. "I'm ready," she announced, meaning every word. They traveled further into the desert than Emily had ever ventured, following trails visible only to eyes trained in reading the subtle markers, indicating passage through terrain, appearing pathless to inexperienced observers. Tariel moved with the graceful awareness of someone entirely comfortable in conditions that would test most people's survival abilities, and Emily found herself adopting patterns that felt both alien and natural. Water, carefully rationed in exact quantities. Rest claimed in shade that required skillful navigation to reach, each footstep selected with consciousness of how it influenced subsequent steps. Their first night was spent camping near red rock formations, providing natural protection. While positioning them to capture dawn's earliest light, Emily observed Tariel constructing a fire, using materials collected during their day's journey. Every branch and tinder bundle chosen for particular qualities she was beginning to recognize. "Fire lives," he said, as flames ignited and started, converting dry wood into illumination and warmth. It requires proper feeding, respect, receiving what it needs for its work. They dined simply on foods that traveled well and needed minimal preparation, flavors speaking of careful preservation and patient planning. Emily realized the desert's quiet wasn't vacant, but rich, layered with sounds revealing themselves only through sustained attention. "Share with me about your husband," Tariel requested as they sat by the fire, watching stars appear in the darkening heavens. Emily felt her chest constrict, then deliberately relaxed into the question she'd been avoiding. For months, he was tender, patient. He could repair anything broken. But he was thoughtful about what truly needed fixing versus what simply required acceptance. She touched the metal locket, feeling the pressed lupine within its silver casing. He adored wildflowers, claimed. They demonstrated that beauty required no permission to flourish. Tariel nodded as though this information validated something he'd already suspected. "And your marriage brought happiness?" "Yes, not flawless, but whole. Like we were each portions, gave something that made sense when united. That variety of love creates a specific form when it concludes," Tariel said. "It's not a wound that closes completely, but a space remaining open for whatever might develop there." Emily looked at him across the flames, understanding he was sharing wisdom gained through his own experience with loss. "Is that what occurred with your wife?" "Eventually," Tariel said. "But first came the period of believing the space should stay vacant out of respect. Required years to comprehend that honoring what was lost might involve allowing what remained to serve fresh life." They slept that night on the ground, wrapped in blankets scented with sage and wool, beneath stars so brilliant they seemed within reach. Emily awakened several times to find herself listening to Tariel's breathing, steady and comforting, in the immense darkness surrounding them. The second day's journey brought them to their goal, a location where the desert floor exposed its concealed layers in a small canyon carved by water, appearing only during flash floods. The revealed earth displayed color bands, speaking of time measured in geological rather than human terms. Emily could see why this place would be regarded as sacred by people who understood clay as something living rather than merely practical. "Here," Tariel said, indicating a seam of pale grey material running like a vein through the canyon wall. "This is clay that holds the most ancient stories." Emily watched as he approached the exposed clay, with rituals she was starting to recognize. Words spoken in Diné Bizard, small offerings placed on the earth, gestures requesting permission rather, then simply taking what was desired. "What makes this different from other clay?" she asked. "Age," Tariel said, "and what it has observed. This clay was deposited before humans walked this land. It contains memory of what the earth was like when only spirits dwelt here." He began carefully harvesting small portions of the clay, working with tools created specifically for this task, collecting only what was necessary while leaving the deposit undisturbed for future needs. Emily found herself affected by the ceremony as much as the material itself. This was art-making as sacred practice, creation, understanding itself as partnership with forces greater than human intention. After gathering what they came for, Tariel guided her to a place where water seeped from rock in a steady drip, creating a small pool surrounded by plants Emily had never encountered elsewhere. The water was clear and cold, tasting of minerals and depths connecting to aquifers flowing far beneath the desert floor. "Sacred spring," Tariel said. "Certain places hold power that enables other things." They refilled their water containers and rested in shade that felt earned through pilgrimage. Emily understood she was being granted access to places existing beyond the normal boundaries of her experience. Inclusion in relationships between human and landscape that had endured for centuries before her arrival and would continue long after her departure. "Thank you," she said, knowing the words inadequately expressed what she was trying to convey. "You understand the responsibility accompanying this?" Tariel asked. Emily nodded, though she suspected she grasped only the surface of his meaning. The clay in their packs carried duties as much as possibilities: to use it properly, to honor what it represented, to remember that some gifts came with the requirement of sharing rather than hoarding. That night, as they began their return journey, Emily lay beside the dying fire and felt something shifting within her chest. Not grief's abandonment, but its transformation into something that could coexist with other possibilities. The metal locket rested against her skin like a bridge between who she had been and who she was becoming. She awoke to find Tariel sitting upright, alert, in a way indicating he was listening to something she couldn't yet hear. "What is it?" "Storm. Approaching," he said. "Still distant, but we should begin walking early. Desert rain can transform everything rapidly." Emily looked up at stars showing no signs of yielding to clouds, but she had learned to trust Tariel's ability to read signs invisible to her experience. They packed in darkness and started walking as first light touched the eastern horizon, moving with the purposeful speed of people who understood that in the desert, respecting weather was the difference between story and tragedy. They reached the community just as the first heavy raindrops began falling, transformed instantly from careful desert travelers to refugees from weather arriving with the sudden intensity Emily was learning to expect from this landscape. The storm lasted 3 days, converting the usually dry washes into temporary rivers and bringing the desert to brief, impossible life. Emily spent the storm days working with the sacred clay they had gathered, learning to prepare it for use through processes requiring patience, attention, and techniques passed down through generations. The clay needed aging, seasoning, mixing, with materials that would provide proper working consistency while maintaining its essential character. Some clay is immediately ready, Nasha explained as they worked together in the space kept warm and dry for such purposes. But ceremonial clay must be courted, persuaded to share its medicine. Emily found that working with this clay differed from any artistic medium she had previously encountered. It seemed to have preferences, responding to certain techniques while resisting others, as if it were collaborating in its own transformation rather than simply submitting to manipulation. The storm's second day, Tariel appeared at the workspace carrying something wrapped in soft leather. When he unwrapped it, Emily saw it was a wedding dress. Not white satin and lace, but something constructed from materials speaking of this place and its traditions. Turquoise and silver jewelry that would complement the dress lay arranged beside it, each piece clearly chosen for significance rather than mere decoration. "My grandmother's," he said simply. "She would want it worn by someone who understood its value." Emily stared at the dress, understanding the weight of what was being offered, not just clothing but inheritance, history, the opportunity to step into a role connecting her to generations of women who had made similar choices in similar circumstances. "Tariel, she struggled with words that felt too small for the moment. "I am asking," he said quietly, "not because of obligation or tradition, but because I choose to, because these months have shown me that love can take forms I had not imagined." Emily touched the turquoise bracelet on her wrist, felt the metal locket warm against her chest. The storm outside seemed to pause, as if the desert itself were waiting for her answer. "I need to think," she said. Tariel nodded. "Of course. This is not a decision to be made quickly." That night Emily sat alone with the storm raging outside and the ceremonial clay waiting to be shaped into something that would serve purposes she was still learning to understand. The metal locket seemed heavier than usual, Thomas's love awaiting acknowledgement before she could move forward into whatever came next. She pulled out paper and began to write. "Thomas, I don't know if this is insane or the wisest thing I've ever done. I don't know if you would approve or worry or think I've completely lost my mind, but I know that the love we shared taught me that love is not diminished by addition, not weakened by transformation. I am not replacing you. I'm not forgetting what we had. I'm trying to honor what you taught me about partnership, about finding someone whose strengths complement your weaknesses, whose presence makes you more yourself rather than less. Tariel is nothing like you, and everything like you in the ways that matter. He is kind, he is patient, he sees who I am becoming instead of mourning who I used to be. I think you would like him. I think you would approve of the way he treats clay art, our attempts to create beautiful things from difficult materials. I love you. I will always love you. But I am choosing to love forward instead of only backward. Emily." She folded the letter and placed it beside the metal locket, then began working with the sacred clay, letting her hands find their way toward forms that felt right for this moment, this decision, this transformation of grief into something that could hold new possibilities. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the desert washed clean, and briefly brilliantly green with plants that had been waiting months for enough water to risk blooming. Emily found Tariel sitting outside his hogan, working on something she couldn't immediately identify. When she approached, she saw it was a bowl. Simple in form but complex in execution, decorated with patterns that seemed to emerge organically from the clay itself. "For the ceremony," he said when he noticed her attention. "If you choose to have one." Emily sat beside him, watching his hands shape clay with movements so practiced they seemed like extensions of thought rather than deliberate action. "I choose yes," she said quietly. Tariel's hand stilled on the clay. When he looked at her, his expression carried depth she had learned to associate with moments when life's surface revealed the currents flowing beneath. "You are certain?" Emily touched the metal locket, then reached into her pocket for the wedding ring she had carried, but not worn since arriving in the desert. She slipped it onto her right hand, where it caught the morning light like a promise, transformed but not abandoned. "I'm certain," she said. The ceremony took place at sunset in the place where red rocks formed a natural amphitheater, and the desert stretched endlessly in all directions. Emily wore the dress that had belonged to Tariel's grandmother, its weight and texture unfamiliar but somehow right against her skin. The turquoise jewelry caught the last light of day, holding it like captured sky. The community gathered in patterns that spoke of celebrations practiced across generations, not formal rows, but organic groupings that allowed children to move freely while elders maintained positions of honor. Nasha had spent days preparing foods that carried ceremonial significance, each dish representing some aspect of the marriage covenant they were witnessing. Emily stood facing west, watching the sun begin its descent toward mountains that glowed like embers in the distance. The metal locket rested warm against her chest, Thomas's ring secure on her right hand, the turquoise bracelet encircling her wrist like a bridge between past and future. When Tariel appeared beside her, he wore clothing that transformed him from the quietly practical man she had come to know into someone who belonged to ceremonies older than the towns and cities she had left behind. His shirt was woven from fibers she couldn't identify, decorated with patterns that seemed to tell stories. In visual language she was still learning to read. The officiant was an elderly man Emily had seen around the community, but never formally met. He spoke first in Dinebizad, words that rose and fell like water over stone, carrying meanings she felt rather than understood. Then in English, "Marriage is the weaving together of two separate lives into something that serves both while remaining true to each. These two come to this moment, carrying the gifts and wounds of their previous experiences, understanding that healing happens through connection rather than isolation." Emily felt tears beginning to gather, not from sadness, but from the recognition of truth spoken with authority earned through long observation of how humans learn to love each other. The ceremony included elements Emily had not expected: the jiaozi, sharing of water from the sacred spring they had visited, the offering of corn pollen to the four directions, the exchange of gifts that carried significance beyond their material value. Emily gave Tariel a bowl she had made from the sacred clay, shaped during the storm days, when decision had been crystallizing in her heart. The bowl was simple in form but complex in meaning, a vessel that could hold water, food, possibilities they had not yet imagined. Tariel gave Emily a necklace unlike anything she had ever seen. Turquoise and silver worked into patterns that echoed the spiral forms she had learned were sacred to his people, representing life's journey, the cycles of growth and rest and renewal that characterized existence in harmony with natural rhythms. As he placed it around her neck, Emily felt the weight of new belonging settling into place beside the old love she would always carry. "I don't know how to be a Navajo wife," she whispered to him during a moment when the ceremony allowed for private words. "You don't need to be a Navajo wife," Tariel replied. "You need to be Emily, married to Tariel. We will learn together how that works." The ceremony concluded as full darkness settled over the desert and stars began to appear overhead. First the brightest, then the secondary stars, finally the faint ones that required full darkness to become visible. The community celebrated with food and stories and music that arose organically from instruments Emily was still learning to identify by sound. Later, much later, Emily and Tariel walked away from the celebration toward the small dwelling that would become their shared home. The new necklace felt strange against her skin but not uncomfortable. Like any significant change, it would require time to become familiar. "Are you afraid?" Tariel asked as they paused to look back at the community, where lights still flickered and voices still carried songs into the night air. Emily considered the question seriously. She was afraid of the unknown territory of marriage to someone whose culture she was still learning, of the practical challenges of building a life that bridged two different ways of existing, of the possibility that this choice would prove as fragile as the previous love that had ended in loss. But underneath the fear was something stronger, curiosity about who she might become in partnership with this quiet man who read weather in plant behavior and created beauty from earth and water, excitement about possibilities she couldn't yet imagine, gratitude for the discovery that love was not a finite resource, but something that grew through use. "Yes," she said, "but it's good fear. Fear that means I'm alive enough to risk caring about what happens next." 6 months later, Emily stood in the art studio that had grown up around the pottery wheel Tariel had built for her, watching morning light reveal work that bore no resemblance to anything she had created in her previous life. Bowls and jars lined shelves that Tariel had constructed to accommodate both function and display, each piece speaking the language they had developed together, her aesthetic sensibility in conversation with his cultural knowledge, their shared understanding that beauty and utility were partners rather than competitors. The morning sickness had passed, leaving behind the steady certainty of new life growing within her. The baby would arrive in the season when the desert lupines bloomed, purple flowers that returned each year, despite the apparent impossibility of surviving in such harsh conditions. Emily touched the metal locket that still rested against her chest, then let her hand drift to the turquoise necklace that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Thomas's ring caught the light from her right hand, while Tariel's wedding band circled the finger that had once carried different promises. Through the studio's open doorway, she could see the desert stretching endlessly in all directions, punctuated by the vertical exclamation marks of saguaro cacti and the scattered green punctuation of ocotillo and palo verde. This landscape that had nearly claimed her life had instead taught her how to live differently, not replacing what she had lost, but creating space for what remained to serve new purposes. Tariel appeared in the doorway carrying tea that steamed in the cool morning air. He moved with the quiet efficiency she had learned to associate with love, expressed through attention to small necessities. "The grant committee called," he said, settling beside her to share the view of desert beginning to wake under morning light. They approved the cultural exchange program. Emily smiled, thinking of the artist residencies that would bring people to this place to learn what she was still learning, that creation was collaboration, that beauty served best when it also served function, that traditions were not museums, but living practices that grew through contact with new perspectives. When do the first residents arrive? Fall after the baby comes, after you've had time to settle into being a mother. Emily leaned against Tariel's shoulder, feeling the solid reality of choice made visible in the life they were building together. The baby moved inside her like a question she was eager to answer, new possibilities taking shape in the space between heartbeats. "I love you," she said, words that felt both familiar and strange. Familiar because love was love. Strange because this love was entirely different from what she had known before. "I love you too," Tariel replied, and Emily heard in his voice the same recognition that love was not diminished by previous love, but made richer by the knowledge that hearts could break and heal and learn to hold multiple truths simultaneously. Outside, the desert was blooming, in the places where winter rain had collected, lupines and poppies and paintbrush, transforming the seemingly barren landscape into something that pulsed with color and life. Emily watched the flowers sway in the morning breeze and thought of Thomas, of the pressed lupine that had traveled from their honeymoon to his final gift, to this moment when new life stirred inside her, and love had learned to take forms she had never imagined possible. The metal locket caught the light, the turquoise necklace warm against her skin, and Emily understood that some journeys led not away from love, but deeper into its possibilities, toward the place where grief transformed, into gratitude, where ending became beginning, where the desert bloomed with flowers that proved beauty needed no permission to exist.